So my music has started. No, it's camera. I'll upload it to our YouTube and Facebook. Okay, so we're just a little early. Make sure everyone's phone's off. The mic picks up everything,
Okay,
guys.
that's what I was thinking.
So we're a little early, but I'll cue you, Mary. Okay. Okay. Okay, The Unruffled Beat of Clouds Below Your Knees by Ray Lynch signals Wednesday, 8 p.m. and time for So What's Your Story? The only program originating in Houston devoted entirely to storytelling, right here on listener-sponsored KPFT 90.1 FM. We are honored to be placed in this coveted spot here Wednesday nights at 8 p.m. where Jay Lou and his crew on Tech Bites had been for so many years. We've been on for a month now, and I think it's working out. Well, you guys out there in Radioland, let us know. Now, stay tuned, because you will hear some wonderful stories here. I'm Mary Edgerton, one of the co-hosts of this wonderful show, and along with the rest of our team, our show creator and co-host Dr. Hank Rubicek, my other co-hosts Warren Holloman and Greg Audell, engineer Nicole Richerlin, syndicator Alondra Mejia, and the newest member of our squad, Lisa Moore. We celebrate the power of story by bringing you storytellers who will take us on journeys through their worlds, and through the windows of their souls with personal stories that bring us together as humans. Tonight, we have Robert, or Bob Dempsey, seasoned flight director with NASA. Bob, or Dr. Bob, as his colleagues call him, is an astronomer by training. He received his PhD at the University of Toledo and worked with the Space Telescope Science Institute, working on the Hubble telescope for many years. He then joined NASA in 1997, where he is currently one of about 24 flight directors. To those of you who were alive in the 1960s, like me, or who remember seeing the film Apollo 13, a flight director is the maestro who orchestrates the mission. Coupled with these incredible challenges, Bob is a longtime fan of stories. As a story listener, Bob, until recently, had not yet realized his own talents as a storyteller. He wondered, if I had a story to tell, would I be able to deliver it effectively to an audience? Well, his first foray was at the Moth Storytelling Slam in Houston. And yes, that very first night up, he was the winner, telling his story to over 500 listeners. So Bob, he realized that he really is a storyteller. Or I should say, you realized you are a storyteller. And I just want to say out there to Radioland, for any of you who haven't unleashed the story within you, listen up and know that all of us, including you, have stories to tell. Best to get inspired by listening to Bob tell us about his journey to becoming a flight director at NASA. You are in for a treat. Bob, welcome to the show.
Good evening. Welcome to be here. Thanks. Good to be here, I should say.
And just how was it the first time you got up in front of that audience at the mall?
It was not as scary as I thought, but that's partly because I really didn't know what to expect.
That's funny. Okay. Tell us, I did mention you were going to tell us about how you came to be a flight director. You've been an astronomer. So can you tell us that story?
Yes. One of my earliest memories is of doing a spacewalk. However, my spacesuit was a robe stuffed with towels, and my tether was the robe's belt tied to my bed, which was actually my spaceship. Basically, from the earliest day, I always wanted to explore space. So, early on, as early as anyone in my family can remember, I said that I wanted to be an astronaut. But unfortunately, I realized when I was diagnosed with needing glasses that I wasn't going to be able to become a fighter pilot. And in those days, it was a fighter pilot that had the right stuff to become an astronaut. However, I knew that NASA needed scientists, and the shuttle program was beginning to ramp up, and they were planning to use scientists as mission specialists. So I decided to follow my passion in science, and astronomy in particular, and become a scientist. So I went off, got my bachelor's and master's and PhD in astronomy and physics, and even though I wanted to work at a place like Jet Propulsion Laboratory or NASA, I got more and more into research on stars. In fact, what I was doing was figuring out how to get a 2 or 3-dimensional image of a star based on the data we could see in a telescope. And slowly, I had a research program going and doing more work on that. And it was a little bit like being a twig on a river that just kind of carried me along. And eventually, this river carried me to Munich, Germany, where I was doing a research project that was a joint project between NASA and the German government on an X-ray satellite. So in 1991, I was living in Germany for a while, and I was real excited to go over there, not only because of the cultural differences that I was going to experience, but I wanted to learn German. Unfortunately, I did not get much experience in talking German because everyone at the Institute, since it was mostly a lot of Europeans, spoke English because that was the common language. But even when I was in town, like one time I lived in a small town outside of Munich, and one time I went into a meat market and I was trying so hard to practice my German, and the little lady behind the counter actually called all the other people over so that she could demonstrate her English. So anyway, I'd been living there a while, and it was the last nice day of the summer, and I decided to ride my bicycle into town to meet a friend of mine to go watch some American football. And we had a good time, and after dinner and everything, it ended up being very late, so I was riding home in the dark. Now, in America, if they were going to do construction on a right-of-way, they would probably put up yellow tape or orange cones or maybe those flashing yellow lights that you sometimes see. Not so much in Germany. So I was riding along on the bike path, and suddenly I pitched over into a hole and hit my head. Now let me back up here for a second, because when I was a child, there was a couple times where I hit my head. One time I was playing baseball with my brothers, and I was the catcher and my older brother was at bat, and I thought it would be very funny if when the ball came down at him, I would jump forward and catch the ball before he could hit it. The net result of that was a bat in the back of my head. That hurt. I bled a little, didn't even go to the doctors, and I just kind of went on with it. There's also another time when I was in high school where I was pruning a tree and apparently grabbed a bad branch and fell down 2 stories on my head. And that hurt, but again, kind of got up, dusted myself off, and just went on with things. So that night in Germany, when I hit my head, I did the same thing. I got up, saw that there was no broken bones that I could determine, and I got back on my bike and rode home. When I got home, my head was hurting, so I took an aspirin and went to bed. And actually, when I got up in the morning or sometime, my head was really hurting. So I walked into town, got some stronger medicine, went back to my apartment. And the next thing I really remember, I woke up on the bathroom floor. I was throwing up, and I was having difficulty moving the left side of my body. And I quickly realized that I'd hit the right side of my head, and I knew enough physiology that there was a connection here. So I quickly called a friend who took me to the hospital. And initially, when I got to the hospital, the doctor said, we're going to take an x-ray and then maybe an MRI. And if things are bad, we might have to do some surgery, but we'll do that in the morning. So they go off and they take the x-ray. Then they do the MRI. And actually, when I was doing the MRI, I was still coherent enough and enjoying it in a sense, because as the magnets were swirling around my head, I was talking to the technician, because the MRI uses the same software routines to reconstruct an image of your brain that I was using to reconstruct images of stars. So it was actually kind of an interesting moment. But shortly after the MRI, the next thing I know, I'm being wheeled down the hall and IVs are being inserted. And I asked what's going on because it was like a scene from the TV show ER. And they said, well, we need to do surgery right now. And that's when I kind of realized what kind of dire situation I was in. And I looked at the doctor, and I'm not sure why I was prompted to ask this at this particular time, but I said, is this a good hospital? And he was very reassuring. And then I told him that I needed to let my mom know what was going on. And without skipping a beat, he picked up the phone that was attached to the wall and said, what's the number? So we called my mom, he reassured her, and then I went off into the surgery room. And even then, I think maybe it was the IV starting to take effect or something, I'm not sure, but I do remember commenting to the doctor that due to the greenness of the room and the sparse decoration that they needed an interior decorator. And then they did put the mask on and said, count back from 100 to 1. And I asked him if he wanted me to do it in German or English because my German wasn't that good. He didn't care, and I don't remember. I think it was about 98 when I disappeared. So the next thing I remember is waking up in my hospital room. And shortly thereafter, the doctor came in and was examining me. And it was at that point that I discovered how really lucky I was. Because from the time that I'd had the injury to the long time that I had before I got the treatment, typically in those cases, only about 10% of the people live. I got my second shock a couple days later when I was feeling a little bit better and I was reading one of the research papers that I was going to try and get published in the near future. And the doctor came in to check up on me and he looked at me and he says, "You understand that?" And I said, "Yes, of course, I wrote it." And I didn't realize, but he then explained to me that for people that had had an injury like mine and had waited so long and finally gotten surgery, that of those that live, typically only about 10% are permanently mentally handicapped. So it was at that point that I realized how extremely lucky I was. And it was one night when I was laying there in the hospital thinking about it. And while I enjoyed astronomy, I didn't really feel that passion, that desire to explore space like I'd had when I was a kid. So when I got back to the US, I went off to the Space Telescope Science Institute, as you mentioned. But unfortunately, since I had research grants, I was still kind of doing some research, and it really wasn't what I wanted to do. So at one point, I then just got on a plane, flew down to Houston, where Johnson Space Center was, and knocked on some doors, applied, and eventually got hired to work on the International Space Station program here. And that opened up a lot of opportunities for me, and after a few years of doing that, I was selected as a flight director. And in my time here, I've been on the Vomit Comet. I have dived in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which is one of the world's largest pools where we can practice what it's like to walk in space. We've assembled the International Space Station. I have led some very challenging spacewalks and some challenging operations to recover failed systems and worked very closely with the astronauts as we've built an amazing scientific platform. And one of these jobs that I was able to do took me back to Germany, where I was able to go to that bike path and drive by that hospital. And I looked at it and I didn't feel sadness or pain, but actually happiness, because that was able to take me to exactly where I always wanted to be.
Bob, that's just a wonderful story. And it's amazing how you start out with, as a child, having your spacewalks from your bed, and you end up flight director as people are having spacewalks in space. I mean, that's quite a connection. I do want to say, because I'm a physician, that you did survive a very serious injury. So I want to take out a little public health moment here. Many of you may remember the very talented actress Natasha Richardson, who had the same injury. She walked away from it as you did, but sadly did not realize the seriousness of her injury. So you've talked about the moment of realizing something was wrong, it having hit your head before. This really entirely was due to your symptoms of vomiting, emesis, as we call it in medical language, and the what was it, left-sided weakness because it hit the right side of your brain. Was there anything else about the injury itself that made you stop and think, should I see a doctor or I'll just go on home?
Yeah, I think since I had hit my head when I was younger, the pain was a bit more than I'd had before, so I knew something was not quite right. However, between not being sure, but also being in a foreign country, I didn't know the language that well. You hear horror stories of people going to hospitals in foreign countries and getting a leg removed, when something wasn't right. Now, granted, Germany was a good place to be, but I was a little bit scared. So I was also a bit in denial, hoping that Tylenol would solve the problem.
Yes, and maybe it's a good thing it was Tylenol, which doesn't thin your blood as aspirin and Motrin would do. So I'm going to throw out there are a few rules of thumb for going to see an emergency room. One is you have the worst headache of your life. You've never had a headache like this before. Go to an emergency room. Go now, and don't drive. You might actually have to call an ambulance. Another one is if you hit your head and you have a moment of unconsciousness, go to an emergency room. If you have a headache with vomiting, go to an emergency room. And if you've hit your head harder than any time before, especially if you've been moving because you're a passenger in a car, you're riding a bike, as in this case, or skiing, as in the case of Natasha Richardson, you may not realize the force. Okay, but so uh, let's move on from there. And just for a moment, let me remind our audience that we are listening to my guest storyteller, Robert Dempsey, aka Dr. Bob. And we're going to hear how he got the name Dr. Bob in a bit. On our Wednesday show of So What's Your Story? Only on KPFT 90.1 FM in Houston, 89.5 in Galveston, and 90.9 in Huntsville. And since we are talking to a NASA specialist, let's realize that if you can get on the internet in space, you can listen to kpft.org live streaming. For me, that's the way to go. I'm your host, Dr. Mary Edgerton, with Nicole Rochelle on the boards. And Nicole, we've been on Wednesdays for a month now. How does it feel? Yes, it's a lot easier than at 10 p.m. So, hey, Houston's a great storytelling town, and you have some proof. Can you tell us what's going on in Houston? Well, Hank, now that knowing what a good liar you are, I just don't know if I can ever believe another word you say to me. All right. Hey, and Dr. Bob just sent me a message that said that the International Space Station does get the internet. So, Bob, I
Yes.
think you need to go back and tell them that uh, on Wednesdays, Central Daylight Time in Houston, and they must know Houston time, right? Houston, we've got a problem, right? They know
Yes,
Houston.
They do know the time, though I will mention that they are asleep now, so they'll have to listen to the podcast.
Okay. Well, tell them to listen to the podcast. Tell them you are on. Okay. Um, Before we hear some more from my guest tonight, I want to let our listeners know that, of course, we'll be back next week, and we will be back at 8 p.m. on Wednesday. And this next time, the rumor is that Warren Holloman will be our host. And it so happens I will be his guest, and we'll be talking about fairy tales, old and updated. This is going to be a fun one. It's going to be a fun one for anybody who's interested in fairy tales, reading fairy tales. I'm really excited about it. As I say, we've got old fairy tales, we have updated fairy tales, we have fairy tales from different points of view, and in fact, even one that I rewrote. So, Bob, let's go back. Let's go back to where you were. You decided on a change of career. You walked up to NASA, and you got a job. And you, besides getting a job, you also got a nickname, Dr. Bob. How'd that go? How'd that happen?
That's correct. When I decided to leave the Space Telescope Science Institute, a lot of people and myself, sort of said, you're going to go work with a bunch of engineers. They're probably going to not like working with an egghead. So I was a little bit uncomfortable with the PhD part of my name. So when I came down here, I did not really want to advertise that. Unfortunately, at the introductory meeting where my new boss was introducing me to all my new coworkers, she had left the resume on the table, and one of the guys that was in the room, who later became one of my good friends, picked it up, looked at it, and said, "Ah, we got an egghead here. Welcome aboard, Dr. Bob." And so much for trying to be under the radar, and it stuck. So that's what everyone knows me as.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. I share your angst because I actually worked at Bubble for a while. Before I was a doctor, I was an egghead doctor. Before I was a medical doctor, I was an egghead doctor. I've gone through several lives. And as an egghead doctor, I went to work for Mobil. Actually, I went to work for Exxon and then for Mobil before they were one and the same. And I realized that egghead docs are nothing. Engineers are God. So I guess it's the same at NASA.
Yeah, it's an interesting environment, and I like actually bringing in both aspects of working as kind of an engineer, but as a scientist. My scientist friends say I don't really think like an engineer, and my engineer friends say I don't really think like a scientist, and I take that as a compliment.
I think so. Well, since we're talking about you and NASA, tell us tell us one of your stories about being a flight director. I mean, we've seen Apollo 13. So what's happened on your watch?
Well, when you hold the lives of 3 people and over $100 billion worth of hardware in your hands, I have learned that it's best to start your day with a double espresso. And I'm going to tell you about one of those days. Now, as a flight director, we go through a great deal of training, simulations, and working with the flight controllers and the astronauts to practice failures and problem solving. But even with all that training, there are times when you lay awake at night and worry about what will happen on that day when something major goes wrong on your shift and you have to make one of those tough decisions. So it was the morning of March 13th, 2009, when I came to start my shift. And literally, as the off-going flight director was going out the door, he mentioned to me that they had been tracking some space debris, but he really didn't think it was going to be a problem. Unfortunately, shortly on my shift, my trajectory officer, who tracks that kind of debris, reported that they had new observations, and he said that there was a small but non-zero chance that it could hit the space station. Now, there's over 500,000 pieces of debris orbiting the Earth at tens of thousands of miles per hour, and these are pieces from old rocket bodies and long-dead satellites. But they all risk hitting the space station. And to give you an idea, something, say, about the size of a silver dollar, if it hit the space station, which itself is going about 17,500 miles per hour, the impact would be like a stick of dynamite going off, and it would blow a big hole in the side of the space station. And in about 12 seconds, the oxygen would be so low that the crew would lose consciousness and die soon after that. So you may not have realized it, but it was my colleagues, my flight controllers and flight directors, and I who were squirming very uncomfortably in their seats during the movie Gravity, because that is our worst case scenario and the type of stuff that keeps us up at night. So after he informed me of this, we also realized that we didn't have time to calculate a maneuver and get out of the way from the debris. And it was times like this that I really wish I was in control of the Millennium Falcon and could tell my flight control team to punch at Chewie and get us out of here. But that wasn't an option. So the team and I, we started talking what options we could come up with. And after a little bit of discussion, we decided to have the crew shelter in space in the Soyuz. Now, the Soyuz is the Volkswagen-sized Russian vehicle that the spacecraft that took the astronauts to the space station and would take them home at the end of their 6-month stay. And it stayed docked at the far end of the Russian segment, part of the International Space Station, and served as a lifeboat in an emergency. And we concluded that if the space station was hit, there was a chance that if they were sheltering in the Soyuz that they could hopefully undock and come home safely. Now, getting into the Soyuz and staying there is not like hiding in your closet during a tornado warning. You have to turn on the life support systems and power systems to turn on the life support systems and the computers to turn on the power systems, so it's a bit involved. Now, we also decided to take some other steps to prepare the space station in case it got hit. For example, we decided to take the solar rays, which are about the length of a football field, and there's 4 of them on the space station, and turn them edge on into the field, the path of the oncoming debris, kind of minimizing its cross section and hopefully reducing the chance of the arrays being hit. But when you park them this way so that they're not tracking the sun, you reduce the power that's generated, which means you have to start shutting down equipment, which basically means, for non-critical stuff, the science payloads. The other thing we decided to do was to close the roughly dozen hatches in between the modules and lock them down. And the reason for this was that if one of the modules got hit, while it might deflate or go to vacuum, the hope was that it would be only that one module and the space station would be able to survive. We also decided to have a few cameras turned on so that if the crew couldn't see what was going on or had to leave, we could maybe see what was going on inside the space station. But all these activities meant that we weren't going to be doing any research that day because the astronauts would be getting ready to get safe and we would be powering down stuff. So I decided to take 30 seconds and call my boss just to give him a heads up. I didn't want him to get surprised by his boss calling him and saying, "Hey, what's going on? What the hell is your flight director doing in there? Because we need to be doing science." So after I did that, my next big challenge was to actually convince the Russians to do this. It's their Soyuz after all, so we had to get them to agree. Plus, they tend to believe in what's called the big sky theory, even though there has been a few cases where some satellites have actually collided in space, and that's one of the reasons we have so much debris up there. Now, convincing them is not like we're doing here where I could sit and just tell you what I want to do. I have to speak in kind of short, simple phrases that then get translated into Russian. They then have to discuss it among themselves to decide if they want to agree or not. They've got to then say it back to me, which then has to get translated in English. So it's a very time-consuming process, and we didn't have a whole lot of time. Unfortunately, politics is part of my job. This is an international project, and after some negotiation, the Russian flight director agreed to the plan. So at that point, we called up the astronauts, told them what we were thinking. They listened intently. They knew that we had their back and decided to, they just went ahead and started doing all the activities that we asked them to do. So they did that. They closed the hatches, turned on the cameras, we configured the solar arrays, they got into the Soyuz and got ready. And then, and Apollo 13 is a good example of this, more times than not, you sit there and you wait. And I watched my flight control team to see signs of an impact. Alarms going off, systems failing, the space station tumbling out of control. And we waited, and after the time of closest approach, as we call it, my trajectory officer signaled that it had passed, and obviously it had not hit the space station. So we were lucky that day. That was the first time we'd done that, but we created a procedure that unfortunately we've had to use a number of times. And in fact, just this past weekend, we thought we were going to have to do it again because some debris came by, but in the last time it was able to be detected as not being a threat. So after we were doing all this, and we called the crew up and said, hey, everything's safe, you can back out of closing the hatches in the Soyuz, and we will try to resume our operations. I've been very focused for those several hours, as we do, of just working the problem, trying to figure out what every risk I had to deal with, coming up with a decision, figuring out the best way to go forward. Excuse me. And for the first time, I turned around, and behind the flight director console in mission control is a big glassed-in auditorium where visitors and VIPs can come in and watch what's going on in mission control. And I looked up there and I realized that my boss was sitting there. And in fact, his boss and all the bosses, all the managers were up there. And for a second, my breath caught and my knees buckled because I didn't realize that. And if I'd known that they were all sitting there, the pressure that would have exposed me to is something that we never trained with in all those simulations. But I did notice that my boss was giving me a thumbs up, and I realized that he unconditionally supported my decision and knew that it was the right thing, that even though we didn't get some science done that day, we were thinking about keeping the astronauts alive and making sure that we were doing the best thing we could.
Bob, that's an amazing story, and I think that from day to day, we've gotten used to having astronauts on the International Space Station. I can't remember when the last one went up and when the last one came down, and we're not getting news bulletins about possible near misses. And yet these things are happening in your life. So 24 hours a day, I guess there is a flight director 24/7 who is managing the mission.
That's correct. Now, we've had people on the International Space Station for 17 years now continuously. And we run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And in fact, on Monday, 3 astronauts that had been up there for 6 months safely returned in their Soyuz over in Kazakhstan. And later this month, we will launch 3 more astronauts that'll be up there for 6 months. So there are continuously about 6 people there full time.
And there are 6 people from how many different countries?
The major partners are Japan, Russia, United States, Canada, and then the European Space Agency, which is a consortium of a number of countries: Germany, France, Italy, England, and so forth.
Now, back to the story about the debris. About how often do you encounter something that makes you have to stop what you're doing and launch into another mode? Just a totally another, because that to me is what this was. You're getting up, you're about to do your science, and now all of a sudden you're ready to avert disaster if it happens.
Yes, the space station itself has some shields on it for small pieces of debris that routinely hit it. Unfortunately, if we can track it, that pretty much would mean that it would destroy the space station. And we're tracking a lot of pieces of debris, and it's not uncommon to, I would say, about half a dozen times a year, we actually perform a maneuver to get out of the way of the debris. And then there's the few times a year where we either find out about the debris too last minute to do something like that, and we shelter in place. But there's a lot of days that we are monitoring debris and trying to see if it's going to be a risk. And that gets to be a challenge because if you do a maneuver, it affects when, for example, the next astronauts, when they're going up to the space station, if you have to raise the orbit of the space station, their orbit and trajectory to get there is now different, and they might not be able to launch if you don't do it right. So it's not something you just want to do, and it requires a lot of complicated calculations, and it affects the mission that's going on. So pretty much, I would say at least once a week, we're fretting over that sort of stuff. And hopefully most of the time it's just fretting and nothing more.
Oh, so I have to say, one of the books I've read, Mary Doria Russell wrote The Sparrow and the sequel, Children of God. And in one of their space flights, a very small piece of debris hits their rocket and wreaks all kinds of havoc. I mean, the rocket goes tumbling. They have to shut off different parts of it. And I remember reading that thinking, huh, can this really happen? And now I've heard this story from you. Yes, can really happen and has really affected our astronauts. Uh, that's quite impressive. Bob, you told me recently that you're writing a book about being a flight director. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's correct. Several of my flight director colleagues and I realized a few years ago that there really wasn't a good book on on operating the International Space Station. Various astronauts have written some books about their time in space. The original flight directors, Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz, have written some books about what it was like being a flight director for the Apollo program. But we didn't really have a good book that kind of talked about what is it like to operate the space station from day to day, whether it be doing a debris avoidance maneuver like I was just talking about, or planning and executing a spacewalk, or as visiting vehicles come up that bring up cargo or astronauts that we're always kind of, that's coming and going. It's a little bit like an airport with things coming and going. And all these activities are constantly going on, and there's a team of men and women that are working 24 hours a day all year long making this happen. And we have a saying in mission control, don't make the news. And that's partly because if you make the news, it either means something went wrong or you made a mistake, and you don't really want to do either of those. So a lot of it goes off very quietly that you don't realize. If we're lucky, you might get a 30-second snippet on the evening news of a launch of a crew or a vehicle or something like that. But there's a lot of work that's going on there, and there's a lot of devoted people that literally lay in bed at night staring at the ceiling trying to worry about what if this happens, or what if that goes wrong, or what have I forgotten to make it work.
That's pretty scary. But uh, now that you've told us about this book, and I know it's about to be published, is there a little piece of it that you can read?
Sure. The working title of the book is The International Space Station, Operating an Outpost in the New Frontier. And the section I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, read you a few snippets from, is related to a mission where I was assigned the lead flight director in 2007. And, excuse me, this was the 32nd mission towards assembling the space station. It had to be taken up in a lot of small pieces and put together. And this was actually the 130th shuttle mission. And when I was assigned, we actually thought this was going to be the last mission. So I thought I was going to be leading the end of the shuttle program, but we actually had a few other missions after that, fortunately. And the events that I'm going to talk about took place over a 13-day time span in February 2010. And when I was assigned the mission, it really had just three basic objectives: was to launch and attach the Node 3 module. And NASA has very creative names for these modules, and it's just one of the various modules that you attach like a Tinker toy. And you can think of it as a tin can about 22 feet in length, about 15 feet in diameter, and it weighs about 42,000 pounds. And this is where we were going to put all the exercise equipment, the bathroom that the astronauts use, and some of the life support equipment. Now, also on that node module was attached a cupola, which is, you can think of it as kind of a hemispherical shaped module, about 9 feet in diameter, weighing about 4,100 pounds. And along kind of the sides of it, it has 6 windows, and the top of it has a big 30-inch window. And this was going to be attached to the bottom of the Node 3 and hang out at the bottom of the space station. And the astronauts would use this to either see vehicles coming and going to the space station, or to operate the big 75-foot long robotic arm. By looking out the window, they could see this directly. Now, when I was assigned to this mission, the cupola, to fit in the shuttle cargo bay, was attached to one of the ends of the Node 3 module. And during the mission, we had to come up with a very complicated plan to attach the power and cooling systems so that we could turn on the Node 3 module, so that we could run the motors that move the bolts that held the cupola onto the Node 3 module. And after the robotic arm moved it to the bottom of the Node 3, where its permanent location was going to be, use the motors again to bolt it up. So we had to get the power system going, activate the Node 3, and one other thing I'll mention before I get into the story is that the cupola and the Node 3 were the only modules in all the assembly of the space station where they were mounted together on the Earth and not in space, and then had to be taken apart, and that's kind of important. And then the last thing I'll mention, when we were moving the cupola, like I said, you can kind of think of it as almost like a teacup with computers and stuff in it, and the windows. And we needed to have a thermal cover that we needed to put in there so that as we moved it, the computers and the equipment in there wouldn't get too hot or too cold.
So, just to simplify this for a minute, in the space shuttle, Node 3 and the cupola are linked together because that makes them fit in the space shuttle. Once you get up there, you have to take them apart and then reassemble them in a different geometry.
That's correct.
Okay. Ready to read?
I am. And to set the stage, this is several days into the mission. The training and hard work of numerous people planning the move of the cupola on the space station over the last 3 years was paying off. The first significant issues with the intricate ballet of module movements came when the crew ingressed the cupola on day 6 of the mission to ready it for relocation. The crew went in and installed a protective cover over the cupola to thermally shield it during the operation. When crew members installed the cover, they noted that the clearance between the cover and some brackets was too small. A thin metal ruler barely fit between the bracket and the insulation. If the clearances were too tight, the cupola could not be mated in its new position. The specially trained contingency teams roared to life to analyze the problem. They considered different options. Could they do the move without the cover? What was the expected clearance on the port where it would be mated, since the modules had never actually been physically mated together in the final configuration on the Earth? Would the motors have enough force to bend the brackets without damaging the structure if there was interference? The root of the problem quickly became apparent, though. To save file size, the computer models did not include bolts, since thousands of bolts added megabytes to each drawing. What seemed like a small issue became a significant wrinkle. After a number of meetings around the clock, the teams decided that there would be barely enough clearance for the cupola to fit. If enough clearance did not exist, it was likely some of the brackets would bend, but nothing would break. This, however, was considered unlikely. The teams pressed ahead toward the relocation. Another spacewalk for preparation, and the Node 3 module, to which the cupola was to be mated, was activated for the first time using half of the power and cooling systems. After the activation, one of the key controllers for the mating of the bolts for the Node 3 module failed into a diagnostic safe mode. While the flight control team tried to quickly interpret the cause, the flight director ensured the team didn't get too far behind on the timeline and that the most critical objectives could still be accomplished. After a power cycle, things were operating again and preparations for the mating could continue. Flight day 8 arrived, and it was time to relocate the cupola. Problems in the system of bolts used to fasten modules together rarely occurred on orbit, So it came as a bit of a surprise when in mission control we saw that one of the bolts had jammed while trying to detach the cupola. After quick discussions with the engineering team, we decided to force the bolt to push harder. The bolt released, but a second one jammed, and then a third. This scenario was completely unexpected. The ground team had to stop to assess the situation and to avoid damage to the hardware. However, it was like having an automobile tire half off, and not a good place to be in the long term. In real time, the team deduced that gravity caused the bolts to tighten unevenly during installation at the Kennedy Space Center, unlike previous modules that were bolted together exclusively on orbit. Therefore, the forces on the bolt would be uneven as the cupola was being demated. This is analogous to removing the adjacent lug nuts rather than the opposing nuts while changing a tire. As in a simulation, flight control methodically nudged and tweaked the bolts. Soon, the cupola was free and moving to the node. The clearances were fine, the computers continued to operate, and the system of bolts worked smoothly as the cupola was firmly mated to the bottom of Node 3. Since things were now running smoothly, the Space Shuttle program and International Space Station program teams agreed to use the extra mission day for the life support rack transfers that were a part of this move. On the 8th day of the mission, the crew was like an army of ants, removing bolts that would hold things in place during the tremendous vibrations during launch, removing items stowed in Node 3, moving the life support racks and exercise equipment into place, and trying to secure all the elements. It was slow work. Each rack was shut down and carefully moved to the new location. The flight control team then powered the system back up. Every rack experienced some small hiccup during the relocation. A cable not connected properly, the software not exactly as it had been tested on the ground, air bubbles in the plumbing. And the teams had to work through each issue. There was so much going on that 2 front room flight controllers were required to work just the various rack activities. The flight director had to ensure that the teams were synchronized as everyone worked in completing the critical activities on the timeline, with ongoing deferring and replanning each move, not to mention working with the engineering support team and the Europeans on the various other working issues. The role of the flight director is not unlike that of a Chinese acrobat who balances several spinning plates on poles. Every shift presents a new wrinkle, such as when the lead extravehicular activities officer, and for the audience that's the guy in charge of the spacewalks, came down with food poisoning and had to go home for a while, creating yet one more issue for the flight director to balance and work through. Due to the length of the mission and the intense work being performed to that point, part of the 9th day of the flight was crew time off. At this time, the crew members were able to rest and enjoy some spectacular views from the cupola. But first, as soon as the crew members awoke, they had a link up with the president. After a brief period of rest, the crew began preparing for the final spacewalk, which would take place the next day. As quickly as the storm of activity began, the mission started to wind down. Although not every task was complete, it was time for the crew of Endeavour to undock and return home. Far more had been accomplished than had been planned for even a year prior to the mission. Endeavour undocked on February 20th and flew around the station. Photos were taken of the newly installed module. The space station crew took a much-needed break and then completed the outfitting of Node 3 and the cupola over the next few weeks. On February 21st, 2010, Endeavour made a flawless nighttime landing at the Kennedy Space Center.
That's a nice, interesting to a story that reminds me of something akin to a very complicated tapestry coming together with threads of different colors from all over within a pattern, and some higher level person knows what the final pattern is bringing in, okay, now bring in these strands of red, now bring in these strands of blue, now you get to weave in until you finally have the picture there.
That's actually an excellent analogy. I mean, and we spent 3 years planning bringing those threads in, and as you heard, and the book actually goes into a little more detail. Uh, like even on a rug, you get some snags, and that's what we have to work through. And that's what we do as flight controllers and flight directors. When things go well, it can actually be a little bit tedious on console, but it's the constant problems that crop up and the changes and challenges that keep us busy and that we're constantly working through.
And it sounds like, at least in this case, if not in all cases, there were many changes and challenges. I love this piece of there. Well, there were no bolts in the diagram because that was just too many megabytes to add to the drawing. So we just left those out. I mean, who needs to have the bolt? We know they're there.
That's true. And, I never could have predicted that one. And it's the type of thing, when, like I mentioned earlier, we lay awake at night worrying about what have we forgotten. And we try to plan for every possible contingency. But no matter how smart you are and how much you plan for, something like that you could not have anticipated happens. And that's why our training that we go through really helps us because you don't always know what the problem is going to be, but you've developed a way to think about it, a way to approach it. And it may sound a little corny, but we really do believe in this in mission control. Failure is not an option, and we're constantly working to make sure that that doesn't happen.
And I guess that was the famous Gene Kranz who's credited with that. Now, now in your story, you keep talking about node 3. Are there just numbered nodes and everybody knows, hey, meet you in node 2 tonight? Nah, how about we do node 3?
Yes, at NASA, of course, while we're great as engineers, we're not the best as artists. So we tend to have very pedantic functional names. The laboratory module, for example, is where the main laboratory stuff occurs. The nodes represent modules that where kind of like a node, you can attach other modules to it. And so Node 3 is what we kind of call it. Now, NASA does like to come up with names that are more user friendly that the public will refer to. So, one of the things that happened during the planning ramping up to this mission is NASA decided to, instead of just picking a name for Node 3, they decided to make it a contest so that the public could vote what they thought was the best name. Now, it turned out that a big fan of NASA is Stephen Colbert. And he loved this idea and took it on his show and ran with it and really made it well known to his fans. And sure enough, it got the most votes to name the module Colbert. Now, NASA as a government entity can't name a piece of hardware or laboratory like that after a person. So they actually chose the name Tranquility. But we really did appreciate what Colbert did. I mean, he was enthusiastic and he actually got a lot of people interested. So one of the new pieces of equipment that was moved into the Node 3 was a treadmill that the astronauts used to exercise on every day. And it was given the name of Combined Operational Load Bearing External Resistance Treadmill, or Colbert for short.
So you're going to go down to the Colbert in Tranquility.
That is true. That is true. And there's been a couple times where we've had to fix Colbert, but it's actually working very well.
Well, next time I watch Stephen Colbert, I'm going to have a whole new appreciation for him because I am a big fan of science. And I will actually be out there on April 22nd marching for attention for science. So,
I will too.
oh, good. Hey, I'll see you there.
Yep.
All right. So I do want to say that here we are, a session, a radio program about storytellers, and we like to have a little tip for the storyteller. And so I think this is a wonderful time to talk about just what a story is. A story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Tonight we've had a guest who's a champion storyteller. Actually, he was a champion at his first foray into the moth. And if you listen to his stories, they each had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Many of us have life experiences that we share in bits and pieces. I know I do it. I have anecdotes that turn into something funny and it makes me the life of the party, but that's not telling a story. So to make them into a story, it needs to be organized into those three parts. The beginning is the part that grabs the audience's interest. Start with a theme. Express it as it fits your story. Your story fills in the middle. The end is the result, and it can be anything. And I'm going to give you a 1 minute story. I was born with a yearning to be heard somewhere, somehow. I entered the storytelling arena with some personal stories and met the co-hosts of So What's Your Story on KPFT. And now I am a co-host of So What's Your Story on KPFT. So there it is, guys, in one sentence, my story. And I challenge you, our listeners, to wake up tomorrow morning and have a story to tell. Just put it all together. So, Dr. Bob, I always like to give my guests a chance to say goodnight to Radioland. Want to say goodnight to anybody in particular or all?
Well, what I would like to say is I definitely have to thank my wife, who has helped me become a good and better flight director and has helped bring the storyteller out of me. And, one thing I like about my job is it's always interesting and changing, and I think there's a lot of stories there.
And we've heard a lot of stories tonight. We heard one about an injury, a brain injury, that turned into a life-changing event. We heard another about day to day some of the emergencies that happen on the space station and the readiness. I mean, when I think of these guys going over to the Soyuz, they might have actually had to detach and make their way home. And then finally, a story of attaching the coupler, which was a dance between one complexity and another, unanticipated. So that's been very exciting. Oh, and if you don't mind, you want to say goodnight to the astronauts, even though they're asleep. Maybe they can hear it on the radio pod.
Yes, so I'd like to say good night to the Expedition 51 crew and hope they're having a good day tomorrow.
Okay, so Brian and Jason are next with To Tell the World, another class act on KPFT. Make 90.1 a part of every day, and while you're driving home, turning in for the night, or just chilling, hey, sitting on your computer or with your smartphone, kpft.org, live streaming, join us every Wednesday at 8 p.m. for So What's Your Story, and treasure what you hear. Keep loving a great story, and we'll keep bringing them to you. Thanks, Dr. Bob, for joining us, and thank you for your stories. Happy Passover, happy Easter, and happy spring to all of us. Greg, Warren, Hank, Nicole, Alondra, Lisa, and I will forever be reminding you it's never too late to live happily ever after. Peace.
So we're done.
Great show. It's a great show. That's what I act like. It's a great show.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Great stories.
So we have to
Great radio voice. Smooth, effortless, conversational, clear.
Well, I've got more stories if you want.
We will. We will. I will definitely add you in touch. And what's great is because we didn't really have to see the person first. You know what it is?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just let me know if you'd like to do that. Okay, what's your name? I'm Shannon. Shannon. What's your name? How are you? Shane. That's Shane. Me too. Certain times, like you, when I know.
Thank you.
So I found you.